Good morning and good evening to our guests in India. My name is Michel Hawkes, and I'm the director for the Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies at the University of Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs. I'm thrilled to welcome you to our Justice in Asia Distinguished Lecture with Professor Romila Thapar, a globally esteemed historian and courageous public intellectual. This is the Liu Institute's second Justice in Asia Distinguished Lecture, which is a component of our Justice in Asia research team established in 2018. This theme is meant to explore justice across disciplinary and regional boundaries and definitions. When our Justice in Asia committee was considering potential speakers for this year, the prospect of inviting Professor Thapar was immediately and wholeheartedly supported. Fortunately, committee member Professor Amitava Dutt had met Professor Thapar years ago and extended the invitation. Thank you, Amitava, for your warm outreach. I also wish to thank and introduce our moderator for today's event, Neeta Verma, the Robert P. Sedlack Jr. Professor of Visual Communication Design and one of the Liu Institute's most active faculty fellows. Professor Verma holds an MFA in graphic design from Yale University and a Master of Design from the National Institute of Design in India. Her areas of research and teaching explore the critical use of design as a tool for social equity and justice. Most recently, she has focused her attention on youth violence in our local community here in South Bend. And with a grant from the Jesse Ball DuPont Fund, she is leading a community-engaged project that focuses on mothers who have experienced an unexpected loss from gun violence. In a workshop, the mothers use stitching, embroidery, painting, applique, and patchwork to create blankets that celebrate the lives of those lost. The resulting pieces are tributes to the transformative journey from grief and loss to resilience and empowerment. Thank you, Neeta, for accepting our invitation to moderate this significant event for the Liu Institute. I now turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Michelle. A warm welcome to all. It is an immense honor to introduce Professor Romila Thapar today and have her lecture punctuate our academic discourse at the University of Notre Dame. Encapsulating her academic achievements in a short introduction is at once daunting and almost impossible. As an eminent historian, Professor Thapar's principal research area is ancient India. She is an emerita professor of ancient history at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi and has received honorary doctorates from the University of Chicago, the University of Oxford in London, Inalco University in Paris, the University of Edinburgh, the University of Calcutta, the University of Hyderabad, Brown University in Providence, and the University of Pretoria. She is an honorary fellow of SOAS, University of London, where she received her PhD in 1958, and a foreign honorary member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In 2008, Professor Thapar received the US Library of Congress's Kluge Prize for lifetime achievement in the humanities and social sciences. Her citation for this award describes how her work has changed the way India's past is understood both at home and across the world. Professor Thapar is regarded for her use of social historical methods to understand change in the mid-first millennium BCE in northern India. An author of many seminal works, her research into early Indian history has been part of the shift from treating ancient history as Indology to establishing it as a social science. There are two themes that are central to her work. The first is the social and cultural history of early India, which involves asking new questions of textual data and integrating some archaeological sources in an attempt at understanding the correlation between society, economy, and religion. The second theme has been historiography, both the modern perspective of writing, the history of early India, as well as the manner in which history was recorded in the early past. She is not just regarded as a historian of ancient India. She is regarded as the historian of ancient India. Please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Thapar to deliver her lecture, Writing History in Contemporary India. Thank you.
Do I start? Well, let me begin, first of all, by expressing my grateful thanks to the Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies at the University of Notre Dame. Thank you for this invitation to speak on the question of academic freedom, which is a question that concerns not only some places, but more or less very many places all across the world, but some more than others. I would also like to thank you very much indeed, Professor Verma, for your most generous introduction. It's always very difficult to live up to something that has been said, you know, with such affection and with such respect. Thank you indeed. It becomes, it becomes very necessary that where academic freedom has to be protected, there, those of us who are in an academic profession should know the current situation. I am using the example of the history of India and the way it is taught and researched in its current crisis. But I'm fully aware that this is not an isolated example, that such things are happening in many parts of the world and in many historical studies that we should be much more aware of. In recent times, the exploration of historiography in relation to Indian history has made us much more aware of the context and of the historians that have influenced the construction of the past, both in earlier times and now. In early India, there are no obvious narratives conforming to what we today call history. And this is not surprising because history also changes in time according to social and cultural change. There are, however, texts that provide information of how the past was represented, if not accurately recorded and analyzed. These are being studied together with historical methods of investigation. Colonial scholars searched for histories of pre-modern India as written by Indians, but could not find them. So they decided to construct the history of India from scratch, from their own perspective. And their investigation of sources was most impressive. The Brahmi script was deciphered, and this opened up a whole body of inscriptions as historical data. Philology assisted the study of language, and excavations revealed an immense archaeological dimension. But discovering the evidence was one kind of activity. Reading it and formulating it as history was quite another. And the latter, the formulation of history by colonial scholarship, was imprinted with the periodization constructed by colonial scholars based on religion. This construction began in the 19th century. Two theories significant to European history were also applied to India, using concepts of race and nation. And the resulting construction of Indian history drew on what was called the theory of Aryan race and also the two-nation theory, both foundational to the colonial construction of India. These two colonial theories, widely accepted even by the emerging Indian middle class, were a century later questioned by professional historians. These were debated and largely discarded. Both theories have now been revived as the bedrock of the Hindutva version of Indian history propagated by Hindu nationalists. Similar to many ultra-nationalist movements elsewhere in the world, Hindutva uses history to legitimize the conversion of India into their ideal state, which they call the Hindu Rashtra, the Hindu state. Hindutva claims that its version is the indigenous Indian one, and what we professional historians write and teach is a Western imposition. Ironically, the foundations of the Hindutva version are in fact the very colonial theories that professional historians have been questioning. There is nothing indigenous about them. What has emerged from the professional historians is a more credible and accurate view of the past. The official effort now is to establish the Hindutva version as the correct history and dismiss the history of professional historians by calling it distorted. The curriculum and readings for all levels of education in state schools and universities are being currently changed and are being placed under central government control. Even universities will be discouraged from adopting syllabi associated with the work of the new social scientific historians. That this flaunts the basic principle of education, namely the freedom to debate and argue the choice of explanations, is really not a concern anymore. School leaving and university entrance exams will be conducted by the central government for the whole of India with a common set of questions. Obviously, objective type questions will be preferred, given the huge numbers taking the exam, rather than questions that require much thought and consideration. The media, social and public, is encouraged to popularize the Hindutva view, and a large number of trolls are employed to abuse those historians whose history disagrees with this Hindutva version. Now, all of this may sound extremely complicated to those who do not live in India and are aware of what is going on. And to clarify what this means, I thought that I would juxtapose the Hindutva version with the readings of professional historians to point out the difference between the two. And this would also explain why we are so weary and so opposed to the Hindutva version. The roots of the theory of Aryan race, to begin with that first, lie in the suggestion of Sir William Jones that Sanskrit, Greek, and Persian as languages could initially have been connected. This led to the idea of an Indo-European ancestry for Indo-Aryan. Iranian Aryan and some ancient European Celtic languages. Comparative studies of the Vedas, the Avesta, and ancient Greek texts strengthened this theory. This was reinforced by later scholarship of the 19th century, preeminently scholars such as Max Muller, working on the Vedic texts. It was argued that the Aryan speakers originated in Central Asia, from where they migrated in small groups to Iran and North India and to Europe. In India, the Vedic religion was viewed as foundational to Hinduism, even present-day Hinduism, and this led Hindus to claim Aryan descent and superior status. 19th century theories of race placed the Aryans high in the racial hierarchy. Two prominent socio-religious reform movements in the 19th century closely adopted this colonial theory. These were the Theosophical Society, established in Madras, Chennai, in 1875 by Colonel Olcott, who made Aryanism foundational to the history of Hinduism. However, Olcott also insisted that the Aryans were indigenous to India and carried Aryanism to other peoples in the West. And this idea has been picked up by Hindutva. The Theosophical Society had a close relationship for a brief while with the Arya Samaj, focusing on the religion and culture of the Aryans as culled from the Vedas. It propagated going back to the pure society of the original Aryas and pristine Hinduism. The belief system was based on Vedic teaching and practice. Worship was in the form of large-scale sacrificial rituals. And since icons were not permitted and not thought of at that time, temples were not needed to house them. And Indra and Agni were the main deities. This construction of the origins and evolution of Hinduism and the Hindus, underlining religion and race, faced, however, a serious problem with the discovery of the Indus Civilization, also known as the Harappa culture, excavated in the 1920s. The Indus Civilization, dating to 2700 BC, preceded the Aryans by a millennium. It declined in the early second millennium BC, which was approximately the period when Aryan migrants began arriving in northern India. The foundations of Hinduism, therefore, had now to be taken back to a pre-Aryan time, to the religion and society of the Harappans. And the Aryans could no longer be the progenitors of the Hindus and of Hinduism, since the archaeological evidence for the Harappans is earlier. Furthermore, the Indus civilization differed substantially from that described in the Vedas. The first was a long-standing urban culture using a pictographic script for communication, whereas Aryan culture was agro-pastoral, unfamiliar with both city life and written communication. We do not know which language the Harappans spoke. The pictograms are still undeciphered, but scholars are suggesting that a Dravidian language is possibly more plausible, given the clues that we have. Linguistic analyses of Vedic Sanskrit certainly point to its having incorporated some Dravidian elements, and this is specific only to Indo-Aryan, which means the elements were picked up in India. Genetic evidence coming from DNA analyses of material gathered from excavations, and this is the most recent kind of evidence that is being considered, seems to reinforce this. The data from Harappan samples points to the population being a mix of ancestral North Indian and East Iranian. But post-Harappan samples, however, do include a strain from Central Asia. The latter dates to about 4,000 years ago, coinciding with the approximate date for Aryan migrations into India. Despite the diversity of sources, a narrative seems to be emerging, although this is a narrative which is not acceptable to the propagators of the Hindutva version. Initially, Orientalism succeeded in isolating Indian and Asian history by treating it as what was called Oriental despotism. New analytical methods to explain the history of Europe brought history closer to social science, but these were not applied to Indian history. Instead, Indian history was explained by variant versions of the theory of Oriental despotism. And the inapplicability of this soon became obvious, and Indian historians began to reject it. In the earlier 20th century, historians supportive of secular Indian nationalism were exploring new ways of understanding the past. But as often happens with a variety of nationalisms, links to history are required. As Eric Hobsbawm writes, history is to all nationalism what the poppy is to the opium addict. There is a link between the two. The ideologies of particular nationalisms draw legitimacy from history, but have to construct their own versions of the history of the nation. And the historian has to be aware of these constructions. And in a sense, this is what my talk this evening is all about, becoming aware of these constructions. For secular democratic nationalism, historical analysis was largely well-reasoned and logical, although some weaknesses were obviously not absent. But opposed to this, and often entirely different, and not necessarily backed by reliable evidence, was the history constructed by Islamic and Hindu religious nationalisms, the two dominant religious nationalisms of the subcontinent, both basing themselves on the colonial two-nation theory. Islamic religious nationalism succeeded in establishing the Islamic State of Pakistan. Hindu religious nationalism is in the throes of establishing what it views as its counterpart, the Hindu Rashtra, the Hindu state. The Hindu Rashtra gives priority to the Hindu citizen, arguing that Hindus are in the majority. History comes into play in asserting this priority. But this can be problematic. How is the Hindu to be defined today? This identity has not been essential in past times, so we don't have clear definitions of what is a Hindu. Hinduism is not a unitary monolithic religion with a catechism and a canon. Those who constructed the concept of what they called Hindutva or Hindu-ness, such as Sarwarkar and Golwalkar, had in mind the political role of Hindu organizations, such as the Hindu Mahasabha and the RSS, the Rashtra Swayamsevak Sangh. Hindutva, therefore, defines the Hindu as he whose ancestors were from within the boundaries of India, Pitri Bhumi, and whose religion too originated within this area, Punya Bhumi. These criteria are doubtful since there were no defined boundaries of India until colonial times. But here, history presents other problems. The Aryans cannot be indigenous if they migrated from Central Asia. If Hinduism is taken back to its historical origins, then its roots are in the Harappan religion and not the Aryan. Hence the need for Hindutva to insist, as it does now, that the Harappans too were Aryans. But for this, there is, alas, no evidence for them. The genetic data suggests that people from Central Asia were present in India for the first time approximately 4,000 years ago. They lived in the proximity of and intermixed with people who were there, who were by definition non-Aryan. The Vedic texts refer to these as the dasas. The richness of the Vedic culture was enhanced through such intermingling. Migrations and cultural mixtures happen frequently in history, and it is for historians to track the outcome of these. This is not conceded in the Hindutva version, rooted in the colonial theories of the 19th century. But new evidence and fresh methods of analysis have resulted in alternative and more viable constructions with the discarding of the older theories. Let me turn now to the second major historical problem posed by the Hindutva version of Indian history. I'm referring to its commonly repeated statement, not only that Hindus and Muslims have always been in conflict, as asserted by colonial scholarship, but that in the second millennium AD, that's approximately 1200 AD onwards, when the rulers were largely Muslim, they victimized Hindus. And in a sense today, there is a revenge that is being sought. It is said to be a period of 1,000 years of slavery for the Hindus. This kind of history draws from the readings of James Mill, who in 1817 maintained that India consisted of two nations, the Hindu and the Muslim, and they were constantly in conflict. The more recent destruction of the Babri Masjid was sought to be justified, firstly because it was claimed that it replaced the earlier temple at the site, of which there is so far very little evidence despite extensive excavation. And secondly, that the destroying of the mosque was to avenge the raid of Mahmud of Ghazni, who raided the Somnath temple in Gujarat, an event that happened 1,000 years ago. Colonial historians propagated Mill's view. Hindu-Muslim antagonism became the standard historical explanation in the histories of this period, until challenged by professional historians in recent decades. The secular nationalists argued for what they called a composite culture, namely that the culture which evolved in these times was one not invariably of antagonism, there might have been a little antagonism here and there, but more often of the intertwining of Hindu and Muslim cultures. However, the religious nationalists, both Hindu and Muslim, emphasized hostility and conflict to justify the creation of two separate nations. The theory of the victimization of the Hindu is being proclaimed today loud and clear by Hindu nationalists, as indeed some of their more ardent supporters are calling for annihilating Muslims. The justification for this is not history, but politics. Let's go back to the history and see what's what. Scribes of the Sultanate and the Mughal administration, that is the second millennium AD, state their loyalty to royal patrons, sometimes by exaggerating their actions. Thus, when narrating the conclusion of many campaigns, some scribes write that 50,000 Kafirs, non-Muslims, and 50,000 Shias, the other group of Muslims other than Sunnis, was slaughtered at the end of the campaign. And this is said for many campaigns. But who among people today stops to think whether this would have been even physically possible? Given the kinds of campaigns that took place in those days, could 50,000 Kafirs and 50,000 Shias have been happily slaughtered on a battlefield? The same argument, borrowed from colonial thinking, is then used to accuse the Muslims of victimizing the Hindus, and never mind the Shias, of course. The Muslim community in present times is then converted into the necessary scapegoat, providing the political necessity for an enemy within society that can be held responsible for all failures, past and present, of the Hindus. Now, we are only too familiar in modern times of systems that bring in the enemy within society. And it's very easy to recognize it, as we are doing. Temples were particularly vulnerable when they acquired wealth, as so many did, patronized by royalty and the rich. Temples that invested in trade had well-stocked treasuries. If it is right that temples were attacked by Muslims only out of hostility to the Hindu religion, and some temples, it is true, were, but not nearly as many as it is claimed, how then do we also explain temples being raided and attacked by Hindu rulers? Surely there's a contradiction here. The Rajatarangani, which is a history of Kashmir written by the Brahmin historian Kalhana in the 12th century, describes the severe fiscal crisis faced by Kashmir in the 10th, 11th centuries AD, in pre-Islamic times. Rulers then began to loot temples, and the worst of them was the Maharaja Harshadev, ruling in the 11th century. He, in fact, appointed a special officer to supervise the attacks on the temples, with the ironic but appropriate designation of Dev Utpatana Nayaka, the officer for the overthrowing of the gods. Was he a role model for future kings? Victimization as a social and political activity is not unheard of, off and on, in most complex societies of past times, perhaps even of present times, as we know. In India, continuous victimization has been of a specific set of castes. Those that were to be segregated were the more amorphous avarna, those that didn't conform to any varna or caste, groups outside the status of caste. They had to live in cordoned off areas and their proximity to people and places was controlled. Many were regarded as impure and untouchable, asprisya, not to be touched. And what could be more demeaning in any human relationship? Employment was curtailed to degrading manual labor. The segregation and social distancing of the avarna categories is a requirement of social behavior in the legalistic codes of caste, the Dharma Shastras. Through the last 2,000 years, this has been the major form of victimization in Indian society. And some of these avarna groups converted to Islam and Christianity, hoping thereby to escape the victimization. But although they could change their religion, they could not change their caste status, and that continued. It is also interesting that some caste Hindus distanced themselves from the Muslims socially because the latter were considered impure and therefore inferior. This was a judgment that was made on many alien groups initially until they became settled and part of Indian society. Commensality, eating together, was thought to be contaminating, and the Muslims are described as mlecha, alien and infradig. Among the elite, however, there was much socializing, as there also was among those working in various lesser professions. If the Muslim referred to the non-believer as the kafir and looked down on him, the Sanskrit texts of the 16th century refer to the Muslim, the Buddhist, the Jain, and the Charvak, all of them as non-believers, nastikas, and looked down upon them. One wonders who was excluding whom. During the years of the powerful Muslim presence in India prior to colonial rule, we find socially respected Hindus and Muslims both participating jointly in a range of activities. We always quote the views of the texts written by royalty and high administration on the sultans and the Mughals. Yet there are multiple texts from this period, many in Sanskrit and more in the regional languages, that record the wider and broader segments of society and life. These authors do not project themselves as victimized Hindus. Let's just look at this relationship a little more closely. The first Muslims to arrive in India were the Arabs, and there was an invasion of Sindh in the 8th century, Western India, but which was of lesser consequence. The effective presence of the Arabs was all along the west coast of India, from Gujarat right down to Kerala. They were traders from across the Arabian Sea and set up commercial neighborhoods at ports involved in what was a very lucrative maritime trade going back actually to pre-Islamic times. And that's a very interesting continuation. The Arabs are referred to, therefore, as Yavanas, which was a name that was used for the earlier people, the people from the West, and sometimes as Tajiks, very seldom as Muslims, which is a comment. The Rashtrakuta rulers of Western India employed some of the Arabs as officers in their administration. And gradually, many new trading communities evolved from this joint activity of Hindu and Muslim traders. New religious sects of mixed religions emerged, such as the Bohras, the Khojas, the Navayats, and the Mapilas, who exist to this day. And these became independent religious sects because they were and are unacceptable to both the Hindu and the Muslim orthodoxy. Central Asian Turks, recent converts to Islam, followed the much trodden routes of invaders into northern India. Their forebears were multiple: the Shakas, the Kushans, the Hunas, the Afghans, and so on. They all came pouring in through the passes. They are referred to in Sanskrit sources mainly as Turushkas, Turks, not as Muslims. They had multiple interests when they settled in India. Muslims and Hindus related to each other at various levels of interaction. Among the early activities was through building monuments. Irrefutable evidence of this comes from inscriptions inside the early monuments, as for example, the Qutb Minar in Delhi. It was struck by lightning and was repaired, and the craftsmen doing this work embedded inscriptions which they engraved themselves on the inner walls of the tower, recording their work, their Hindu names, and invoking their deity Vishwakarma, whom they worshipped. The pattern of employment would have been the same for all these buildings, with the administration employing a variety of masons and artisans. The inscriptions carry no mention of discrimination or ill treatment. The invocation of the god Vishwakarma is striking. Trade in various commodities involved a mixture of people. The weavers, for example, of fine Chanderi cotton were Muslims, but the traders and the merchants were all Hindus. So obviously there was an interesting interaction between the two. At the upper end of the social scale was royalty. Here there is evidence of closer intermixing. The sultans and the Mughals, not to mention lesser royalty, married into Hindu families of status. Feroz Shah Tughlaq's mother was a Hindu. The Mughal royal family took wives from the Kachwaha Rajput Hindus, who, despite their high status, high caste rank, gave their daughters to Muslim families. There was no such thing, of course, as love jihad in those days, which we are bothered with now. High administrative office, and more so in Mughal times, was in the hands of Rajputs, Brahmins, and Kayasts, as it had been earlier as well. But then in Mughal times, retainers from elsewhere were also added. This was an acknowledgement that the local elite did know how to manage the administration. Mughal administration, even if centralized, did have place for small principalities to be ruled by local elites. They were given mansabs as a way of ranking them in the new social order. Rajas became feudatories of the sultans and the Mughals. Todarmal, amongst them, Mirza Raja Man Singh, Birbal, handled state finances and campaigns with great aplomb and were respected by the courts. Man Singh led the Mughal army against Rana Pratap in the Battle of Haldi Ghati. And we learn much from the writings of the Brahmin Chandrabhan, who held the highest offices even in the court of Aurangzeb. They were all patrons of culture as well, as is evident not only from the architecture and the buildings, but also from the collections of miniature paintings that they held. The majority of the artists, interestingly, in the Mughal ateliers were Hindu, whereas the Muslim artists found better employment at the Hindu courts. So there was, again, a mixing. Interventions in court politics by Hindu Rajas were not unusual when they supported particular factions in relating to the court and the royal family, especially when it came to succession. The intricate politics of the Orsha Rajas of Bundelkhand and the Mughals, involving succession in both dynasties, is but one example of these complexities. Mughal court politics was involved in the construction of the Govinda Dev temple at Mathura, as also the later pulling down of another temple at the same place. So you get contradictions due to a variety of reasons. Political complexity cannot be reduced to Muslims victimizing Hindus. It involved the participation of both in diverse ways. Sufis coming from Central Asia and settling in India was another aspect of cultural interchange. Sufism was not identical with Islam. It was very much a Persian Central Asian version. It was eclectic and absorbed elements of other religions, if so required. A characteristic of many Sufi sects, though not all, is their openness. This was complemented in the more popular Indian religions. And religion was, as I said, not monolithic and unitary, so each related to a range of sects representing diverse views. This is also seen in what we have called the Bhakti teachings, movements of devotional worship across the subcontinent. Beginning in South India from the mid-first millennium AD, with the compositions of the Alvars and the Nayanars, these versions of religious articulation have continued into modern times. The deities changed again from Indra and Agni to Shiva and Vishnu, and later to Shakta worship. Their texts were initially the Purans rather than the Vedas, but soon gave way to their own teachings, different from each of these earlier texts. Each devotee chose a deity. The rituals, therefore, were often personalized. The place of worship could be anywhere and not necessarily in the temple, now richly endowed by royalty and controlled by Brahmins. The Bhakti teachers were frequently not Brahmins. Their poems, prayers, and texts were composed in the popular regional language, Tamil, Hindi, Marathi, Bengali, Punjabi, and such like. It was accessible to the larger population, even those uneducated and far from being wealthy. For these devotees, the act of worship was devotion to deity. One segment among them carried a strong message of worship being equally accessible to all, and quite remarkable in a world of general social inequality. The Muslim elite, imitating the Hindu upper castes, segregated the Muslims of lower castes, the Pasmandas as they are called. Kabir, the Bhakti preacher, some would say par excellence, insisted that Allah and Ram were equally available to everyone. He did not have to assert that he was born a Muslim weaver, but became a devotee of Ramanand. His message drew from both and many more. Social equality was also emphasized in the teachings of Dadu and Ravidas. The religion of one's birth did not prevent devotion to any deity. Muslims from various social backgrounds also became devotees of the god Krishna, Krishna Bhakts, dedicating compositions to Krishna. Ras Khan came from a landowning family, and as a prominent devotee, his compositions are still sung in Hindustani classical music. Another popular devotee was Bulle Shah, who represents a long tradition in the Punjab of using idioms both from Hindu and Muslim sources. That the universally used word for God in the Punjabi language is Rabb, which is an Arabic word for God, tells us much about religion in this region.
Professor Thapar, we are coming to the end and we'd like to keep some time for questions.
All right, so I'll close.
Thank you.
We have, therefore, two different versions today of how the past is represented. The Hindutva version, based on a largely imagined past with virtually little evidence to support it, and the alternate one being that of the professional historians drawing on a careful evaluation of the evidence and generalizing only from the logic of the analysis. The two differ in essentials. And the reason for worrying about the Hindutva version is that it is now no longer the plaything of the media, but is being made the official version of Indian history in many cases, taught in the new curriculum at every level. School textbooks are based on its premises, as are university curricula. And in their political manifestation, such historical theories are used for culling society, as in many parts of the world in our times. Let me conclude now. The system of education being introduced is one in which the questioning of existing knowledge and seeking answers is not encouraged, and in some instances, not even permitted. It is to be replaced by tabulated information that has to be memorized like a catechism and repeated for examinations. Exams have less use for writing essays and are more dependent on answering objective type questions. One can well imagine what this will do to the teaching of subjects such as literature and history. Disciplines such as history, comprehended through using analytical methods, can be halted. In such a system, academic freedom becomes irrelevant. Those who control the inputs into education disallow it. And for those at the receiving end of this education, there is no choice, even when it is recognized that what is being taught may be flawed. Questioning, therefore, let me repeat, becomes imperative. Thank you. Sorry, I overstepped the time.
No, thank you so much for that amazing lecture. I now would like to invite audience members to submit their questions through the Q&A. We have only 8 minutes left, but I'll start with one of a pre-submitted question. It asks, given the right wing's current hegemony in India, are we dealing with a failure of the academic community? It's sent by Arpit Kumar.
To which my brief reply is, I hope to God, no. I think what we're dealing with is a quiescence at the moment in the academic community, a rethinking of why, in fact, things didn't go successfully in terms of increasing academic interest in the disciplines. And I think that once this kind of thinking gets going, however much it may be sought to be stopped, it will result in certain challenges to what is being done at the moment. I'm slightly hopeful.
Thank you, Professor Thapar. We have another question from Professor Datta. Many people believe that we should look for the truth of what happened in the past. However, even in the social sciences, talking about the present and recent past, it is unclear what should be focused on, what the facts are about them, and how they should be interpreted and explained. The history of the ancient past is hampered not only by the absence of information compared to now, but the problem that there is no objective history. All writing of history has to have some preconceived notions and lenses. The Hindutva version is the current manifestation. They may well say, yes, we are blessed, but so is everyone else. You have stressed the importance of appealing to archaeological, genetic, and written evidence, and by questioning biases to the extent possible by examining other perspectives. But in the social sciences, we are understanding that values and facts cannot be separated. So here's the question. In your view, what role does the values such as justice and tolerance have in writing history?
I think values are something that always have a role, however close or distant the historian may be from them. They do play a role because it is, after all, through these values that we begin to come close to society and to the people that constitute that society. Let me say right at the beginning that I don't believe that history is a search for the truth, because A, there is no such thing as the truth. Secondly, I think that we are incapable of finding it in an area which really exists in our minds. I mean, yes, there are a few monuments to prove that, in fact, we're not fantasizing. But basically, the construction is something that exists in our minds, and we like to think about it and so on. There's much more philosophy involved, I think, in the writing of early Indian history than people realize. So what is it that we're after? As a historian, I am not interested in trying to discover the truth. I'm interested in trying to understand the past. I'm interested in picking up all the clues that I can get from whatever sources. And the nice thing is that the sources are expanding. I mean, who thought 100 years ago that genetics would be playing such a major role in the understanding of Vedic India? This is really unbelievable, but there it is. It is an argument that's being made. It's an argument that has to be met. So the sources will go on expanding as our knowledge about the world around us increases and gets larger and larger. Looking at these sources, putting them in relationship to each other, seeing causal links where they seem evident, but above all, proving the reliability of that evidence and using it only the reliable evidence, it may be possible to understand something of the past. And why do I place so much emphasis on understanding the past? Because I think that it is necessary for us to understand the past if we are to understand certain aspects of the present, both understanding them and contradicting the misconceptions. I think these are very necessary. And when historical misconceptions are abused, then the historian has to be at the forefront.
Thank you, Professor Thapar. The questions are coming in, so we'll extend the session by just 5 more minutes, if that's okay. We have another question from Vipul Sangoi. What would your solution be? Can religion and caste be totally done with?
No, I don't think so. I don't think religion needs to be totally done away with. And I think caste can be replaced. It'll be replaced anyway, as it is in some parts of the country, by class. We're all beginning to talk about the middle class now, and people are talking about the upper middle class and the middle class and the lower middle class, the movement of castes into class categories. So these are historical changes that are perfectly possible and can be thought about. I think that you can't do away with religion because most people like to have a belief in something. It's a source of psychological strength, perhaps. I don't know. I haven't had that experience, but still. And I think the important thing is not to say that we're going to do away with religion, but to say that religion has to be put in its place in terms of society. What is the role of religion? The role of religion is not to be looking after the education of people. It's not to be looking after the marriage agreements of people or the property, the inheritance laws of people. This has got nothing to do with religion. Religion is worship. It's the worship of deity or non-deity or whatever it is that you wish to worship. Go ahead and do so, but don't bring it into these social institutions, which have to be kept independent of religion. And I think that's really the only way this thing can be solved. Though, of course, given the history of religion and the dominance it has had in societies of the past, there will always be the politics of using religion. So you're not going to get away from that.
Thank you, Professor Thapar. We have another question from Arkabrata Bera. And the question is, you have mentioned that Muslims were not mentioned as Muslims, rather with their regions. Thus, do you find any type of religious conscience amongst them? I want to cite an example. Vijayanagar Empire at its end fought with the sultans, which were broken from the Brahmini Sultanate. All the sultans from later collectively declared jihad on Vijayanagar Empire, leading to the latest end.
Sorry, what's the question?
I guess, thus, do we find any type of religious conscience amongst them, amongst the Muslims, which are being defined through their religions?
Oh, of course, yes. I mean, you know, I have problems with the use of terms like Muslim and Hindu and etc., Buddhist even now. And then generalizing about how they thought and how they behaved. Every Muslim, every Hindu doesn't think and behave in the same way. There are large bodies of people who have an identity which they use from religion, but they behave in different ways from each other. The identity of religion simply remains there. So I think that it's not that that one is trying to suggest that this identity of religion is central. But which group are you talking about, and which kind of religion are you talking about? This is where the historian comes in very importantly. The religion practiced by the Mughals is very different from the religion practiced by the traders, is very different from the religion practiced by the chaps who are helping build mosques or whatever it is that they're helping to build. So I think we have to learn to break this down, which is why I'm so interested that in the Sanskrit texts, it's not that they don't ever mention people being Muslim. The majority of the references are to ethnic groups and social categories of that kind. They talk about Yavanas and Tajiks and Turushkas and so on, rather than what we do, which is to say Muslims all the way through, and don't differentiate between the Arab traders who are ancestral to the Bohras and the Khojas and the Central Asian guys who come in and set up Sufi khankas and the others. You have to learn to diversify and look at the specifics of these things. You can't use these broad labels any longer. The colonials could do it, but not us.
Thank you, Professor Thapar. We have one last question from Rajiv Duga. Wonderful review of some probing counterexamples, as always, to the dominant narrative of the day. Can this be dealt with only on an academic plane, or is it a mass movement required involving not only academics, but artists and other intellectuals? After all, Kabir or the Baul tradition take the ideas down to the level of everyday 2-cent words, as call them in the American parlance, for more effective mass dissemination to counteract mass indoctrination.
Oh, I think absolutely these thoughts that should go down, should go across to many, many people, as we are trying to do. And this is where the trolls come in, of course. The moment you open your mouth in public and say these things, there are, 1,000 entries of the trolls who abuse you in the most disgusting manner. I mean, it's terrible. But anyway, there it is. One carries on in spite of the trolls. Now it's got to the point where all of us are beginning to laugh at all these things that are coming in. I mean, they really are quite ridiculous and so on. No, the point is that this is where school textbooks are so important, because this is the kind of information that should go through in school textbooks, which is never going to reach school textbooks under the present regime. But textbooks, the media, for example, will not pay any attention to the kinds of things we say, because the money all comes in from people wanting to watch the conventional things. So again, I think that these are ideas that need to be taken out and need to be discussed much more openly. This would be fabulous if they were discussed much, much more openly. But what are the agencies through which one can hold these discussions? I don't know. I'm beginning to think that, yes, the bowels were great, and we had this whole tradition of the oral tradition, which was really quite remarkable. I mean, it hasn't been properly studied as yet, but still. Now, what is the equivalent of that? It's this kind of thing, Zoom and stuff like this. How are we going to use this technology? This is where we need to use the technology. It has been used by the right wing in India very effectively. My God, I mean, what I refer to as hologram politics and all the rest of it, very effectively it's been used. That is where the counter has to come. You have to counter that kind of pronouncement of this is what we have to believe in by saying, no, we don't have to believe in all of this. We believe in what we like to believe in.
Thank you, Professor Thapar. This has been just a very fascinating exchange all around. And thank you for kind of holding the keel on this whole conversation. So to our guests, I would like to say that unfortunately, we are out of our time. And on behalf of the Liu Institute, Professor Thapar, we would really like to thank you for this amazing lecture and your precious time. Audience members, thank you for joining us today. I encourage you to keep up with the Liu Institute and its events by visiting us on asia.nd.edu/events. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Neeta.